in more recent years I've seen windmills being used, I've seen this heat pumps, and I'm just wondering, does that matter at all, really, as to the type of system that's used for central heating? It's all heating water. Most of the systems heat water in the pipes and in the central heating system. That's just one point. And I've heard this. I don't know how, is it anecdotal or otherwise, that there's more and more emphasis now on insulating houses. So you have maybe warmer houses than we had 20, 30 years ago. But no matter what system you use, you're going to need some way to trigger off this heating of water in pipes. I suppose in recent years I've seen in the countryside again solar panels being used. So I wonder, is there any, to your mind, whether it's the department or Mr. Buckley, is there any differentiation about how the water is heated, number one? And then the other issue is there still an issue about if you're unsure about water, that you actually boil the water, as they say? There's boiled water notice all over the country at the moment in different systems. And I know we mightn't get into the health area today, Chairman. I think we said we might do that, but I mean, I just to put people's mind at ease. I think you've reassured us on a lot of things in what you've said, both of you. But is there an issue that boiling the water is one way of dealing with the question of disease rates that you might have in it? There's one last point, Chairman. Oh no, can I just leave that? I want maybe one other question when you maybe answer those, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. To deal with a couple of the points, maybe first of all your last point about boil notices and boiling water, I think that is a completely separate issue that deals with the quality of the incoming water supply through the rising main and whether there's an issue there. The contamination, the risk of contamination we're talking about here is different chemicals, and there'd be no guarantee that boiling the water would alleviate that problem were the problem to exist. So just to separate that out. To take your broader point on the huge range of heating systems and indeed almost every aspect of a modern house, there's so much technology involved, and as you rightly say, insulation has changed. In the world of standards, we are working very hard at a European level, and this is where I suppose Ireland has an advantage to be part of the big European system, to keep up with all these changing technologies and to have proper standards reflecting the different products and the different ways they're applied. And there are something like 600 or 700 standards related to the construction products regulation alone, never mind the application of those. So it is tricky to have those up to date all the time. We can do that as members of the EU. Those standards then are available. Many of them are adopted and referenced in the building regulations, which makes them legally binding, to answer the earlier question. So if a deficiency is found, then it can be addressed immediately. Even if they're not directly referenced in the building regulations, they are an indication of best practice. So if I know a purchaser has a dispute with a developer and the situation is unclear, the courts in Ireland, as in elsewhere, will reference the standards as an indication of best practice. And if the installer does things in some different way, well, then the onus is very much on them to prove that the system is safe. So the standards are very valuable in that respect. And I guess even with the increasing sophistication and with the variations of systems, one must look at the skill set and the training of the people doing the installation as well. And this is why, bit by bit, all of the traditional trades are coming more and more under a structure. So, for example, in the area of gas and the area of electricity, we have very precise control systems through RGII and other bodies, and that's in place for a number of years, and it's very accurately regulated. It works well. For other trades like plumbing, we're not quite at that point yet. And that's where this standard referenced, starting way back in 2010, comes into its own. It's the first attempt to pull together all of this technology to have a guidance base for plumbing, the plumbing profession, apprenticeships, and so on. So it's great to have the support of the Department of Environment and SEAI, and we work very closely on that. The industry itself must also come along, and they must see the need to do that. And of course, the plumber is a traditional trade, maybe passed on from father to son. So we're trying to balance, I suppose society in general is balancing the need for a greater level of sophistication and controls versus the keeping the existing infrastructure in place, and to find the right timing for that. So these are all very complex, interrelated matters, and there's any number of technical risks involved. We would do a lot of work on radon control, for example, which is an issue. Insulation systems, as you mentioned, even in water quality. There's the issues raised in the petition, but there's concerns about Legionnaire's disease and other impurities that can happen in the water system. And all of these are covered by different aspects, and it's to get a balance of all of this is the task at hand.
Thank you, Chairman. Just my other question was something I've only heard about lately, but I'm sure it's there for ages. This idea about zone heating, and I'm talking about bigger houses where people. I've talked to some people in the business about this, where you could literally you could have in a quite a big house, you could have 2 zones or maybe 3 zones, and I would just worry about it in the sense that you have different parts of the house are warm and other parts are not. And is there any issue there, Chairman? I want to ask the question: is there any issue there of water, if you like, being contaminated in that situation? You know.
Would you want to?
Mr. Smith.
Michael, how are you? I'm a Mayo man. You're Galway. I live in Galway.
I'm Galway,
no, there's the zoning of it is an effort is within our Part L of the building regulations for actually preventing the energy losses that you would have when you're heating areas that you actually don't want. So most systems now are actually zoned with a manifold system, whereby you based on thermostats in the various areas, and they'll turn on or off automatically the area depending on what, and on time frames. There's no risk. All of those systems are actually close, so there's no risk of actually getting close even to the water that's involved in it anyway, and all the temperature will always be above 60 degrees, and Legionella is killed automatically within seconds at 60 degrees. You know, so there's actually there's no risk in any of them. Anyway, you wouldn't, for the likes of Legionella or something like that, you need to actually have to inhale it through an air spray kind of thing, aerosol type thing. So you know, shower heads, for example, are historically one of the ones that give it a problem, and in fact are doing it in the health issues at the moment, but not within any sort of heating system. And I suppose going back to the other types, all the different heating systems you have at the moment, oil and gas in particular, they're all based on hot water systems heating, as we would have had normally. Even the back boiler systems were the same. The only one would be your air to water heat pumps, and they rely on a heat transfer, and then once you have the heat transfer, it's the same system inside from a distribution point of view, you know.
So you're saying even, and I know Mr. Buck referred to maybe not all the standards would apply to the plumbing end of it yet, and that you're saying that the water would be coming in from the mains anyway. It wouldn't be contaminated if you had heat on and heat off in different parts of the house.
Yeah, normally there would be no connection between your mains water coming in. Your mains water traditionally, and under any of the standards, come in, it services your actual tap in the house. It then normally goes to your storage tank, and everything is fed back off that. As the petitioner rightly says, in recent years we've gone to the European system where we pressurise the system. Historically, in our day, or at least in my day, you actually had your expansion tank in the attic, your 40-litre expansion tank with your expansion pipe on it as well. That totally separate to your actual normal storage tank. the European system, people have been copying that, where they pressurise the actual system directly using a pressure vessel, pressure release valve and a pressure gauge. And they've used, rather than using a pump system or something like that, they use the mains pressure to fill and pressurise the system. You know, I suppose there's nothing wrong with that. It's allowed, but it is temporary. You should have a temporary connection to it with a double check valve on it or a protection on it when you're connected. And your actual your shut off valve. So the result of it is that in order to get contamination, you would actually have to have it connected, have a sudden depressurization in your main supply, and the double check valve to fail before you would actually get contamination of the system. You know, the problem is that people are leaving them permanently connected, which is not supposed to happen. And as the petitioner says, appear to be potentially putting in maybe a valve that isn't as robust as the one that's recommended. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Deputy O'Snoddy?
Yeah, no, just intrigued by the last contribution, but I can come back to it, just the last piece there, because that suggests that there is a problem. And I think that's part of what the petitioner wrote to us about, to identify, is there a problem and what action should be taken. I want to first ask the representatives, and I want to thank us for being in front of us, because for most of us mere mortals, some of this is quite technical, and we bring to it our own life experiences in some ways. But I want to find out, are they aware of these valves, the non-returnable valves, failing to date? You know, has there been a number of them fail? Like, I know, for instance, I moved into my house at this stage, 2010, I think, 2009, and the plumber who had taken on the work, he disappeared quite soon afterwards. But we found a number of issues quite quickly as a family. The pressure pump went straight away. The thermostat that you mentioned on a radiator, one of them disappeared. So I had very hot temperature in some rooms. And they're simple steps. They could be easily changed, and the builder came and fixed it because it was under guarantee, and replaced it with something that works. But that's somebody who went and bought the equipment, put them in, and they failed. So has there been a noticeable increase in these valves being reported as failing, whether in commercial or domestic systems? You also mentioned in the presentation that since 2006 you've been working on a standard. Now, I think at this stage that's a long time, and I know there's quite a lot of other standards that need to be worked at. But given that we're about to, supposedly the Minister has told us in Taoiseach that we're coming out of a recession and out of austerity, and there's a demand for a huge amount of housing in this city but also across the country, is it not very urgent to have new house building or home building standards in place to ensure that we don't replicate what we've been hearing in the news, not just in terms of water but others, and that those standards be protected? And I know you mentioned that once they're in primary legislation or in probably statutory instruments, they have a protection, or at least a way of enforcing them. Would your preference be, or would you believe that it'd be more appropriate that those standards should have that protection, if at all possible? There's a I'll take those, yeah, because that's just on yourself.
Okay, to take some of those points, I can't comment on the incidence of valve failures. We wouldn't have that information. Maybe my colleagues might be able to comment there. But on the second point, on the SR50, the plumbing standard, yes, I think it would be an addition to complete this standard work now. It has been there for a long time. And as I say, the reason for that is, one, a question of resources, but also a question of the industry agreeing the right level of regulation for the actual practitioner themselves. So are we talking about some sort of a registration system for plumbers that the plumbers themselves would go along with? Are we talking about some sort of central regulation? And this is a question that has wider implications and may have implications for that particular sector, that particular trade, for the cost of buildings, for so on. So that has to be all taken together. But certainly, I think we in the NSAI, and I think our colleagues from the Department of the Environment, would be of the view that the time has come now, certainly, to have that reference standard there to feed that into the training systems, the apprenticeship systems, and so on. And I think, as earlier mentioned, that standard has been actively worked on, and we'd hope to have significant progress on that, with hopefully everybody involved, and through your efforts in the committee here, it might encourage the various different other stakeholders, the industry stakeholders, to become involved in that work, that we can get a high quality document very quickly.
Yeah, no, I welcome that, but just kind of I know sometimes it's difficult to get agreement. Our job is to ensure that kind of the best standard is set out for all of this, and whether there's agreement or not, I think we should encourage yourself and those to try and get that as quickly as possible before we go through another large phase of house buildings. Because I remember, like, I'm not that old, but I remember not so long ago, Qualpex, for instance, was not a standard in Ireland, kind of for domestic use. Qualpex is the pipe it's a flexible pipe made of rubber or plastics or whatever that's used, whereas before all household and domestic pipes were copper. Copper is dearer, copper is also not as pliable, and kind of also is not is in shortage supply worldwide. So kind of there are standards, like asbestos was a standard years ago. Lead is still a standard because nobody has decided to remove lead from the thousands of houses here in this city. And mention was made of Irish Water having the right to tell the householders to fix their problems in their house if the water system is going into. But I know tens of thousands of houses in this city kind of have within them, kind of not outside, which is the responsibility of the City Council or Irish Water, but within them, kind of a health hazard as we speak, never mind what the petitioner has argued with in terms of the lead within their system, because they're going through lead piping, which can be up to 50 or 60 years old. So the standard that we're setting in Ireland, and we've set before, is often out of step with European standard, but sometimes they're catching up with us and sometimes we're catching up with them. I've talked to electricians who've said that their standard in Ireland is higher than many of the European countries. I don't know. I'm not an electrician, and that's the argument. All I want to know is that that there is a standard set in Ireland that will ensure the greatest protection for the ordinary Joe or Josephine who buys a house or rents a house, that the water they're getting in their tap is fit for use. And the quicker that's done, the other question is, if you bring in a standard now, would it be retrospective? And maybe that's a question for the minister themselves, because if it is retrospective, it means a retrofit. So we're setting new standards for insulation. The government's given grants for retrofit. I'll just finish it on I have another one question. Just
I'll let you back in. We might just get a response, and there was the previous.
Just to be clear, there are standards there right now. There are a lot of standards for all of those different aspects of the system and the installation. In fact, you might argue at times there's nearly too many standards, and the trick is to provide guidance to navigate around the different systems and know what's appropriate in different areas. So I think the question of retrofit doesn't apply here, because the standards are there. It is possible to say what is best practice, and nobody, I think, here is disagreeing what best practice is. The problem is where best practice hasn't been followed. And so retrofit, yes, in individual developments where it's found that the workmanship wasn't up to scratch. And then we have all these horrendous issues we're having to face at the moment of are the developers still available to challenge and to chase down for unsafe workmanship. But the reference point, the standard provides the reference point, and that is there. So it's not that the technical standard has dramatically changed over the time. That's been a steady progression which Ireland has followed and adopted all of the best practice as it's happened. The issue is to ensure that that's used across the industry properly.
Ms Neary, you wanted to respond?
Yes, just to maybe go back to one of your earlier questions, the instance of failures. We have no reports on the instance of failures of double check valves or single check valves to date. However, kind of putting the statistics to one side, all mechanical devices or fittings are liable to fail at any time, and in this particular situation, while the double check valve is there to prevent backflow, the real reduction in risk is from the fact that you disconnect this temporary pipe completely. And that's really your safety mechanism in terms of only filling the system at the beginning and for replenishing for one reason or another, and not leaving it permanently connected to the mains. And that's the primary defence mechanism. In relation to standards and retrospective application, regulations don't apply retrospectively, so it wouldn't be a matter for a retrofit to this standard. Concerned homeowners in this situation may apply the best practice, as Mr Buckley has outlined, is available there in many sources. It's very explicit. It gives good advice on what to do, and it's reasonably inexpensive and simple for them to carry out where necessary. When SR, then in terms of the future and that, once SR 50 is finalised and published, the department, the various sections between water services and building regulations and Irish Water, we will consider the policies and legislative requirements in this area in order to implement SR 50. And then just maybe a final point on home building in a general sense. The building regulations covers a large part of the home building functional requirements, and the building control legislation that came in recently has created a very controlled system where the design is signed off by a competent person. The building process itself then is inspected on a regular basis by an assigned certifier competent in the area, and that the builder and the assigned certifier then at the end of the process signed off that this complies with the building regulations.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, there's just one or two more questions to yourself there, or the team. Because one of the problems we've identified in terms of building reg, and you're accepting it yourself, basically this can be a problem unless somebody has an understanding that it's a problem, or unless somebody inspects it. So people leaving the temporary connection in place. I wouldn't know, looking at the pipework in my house, whether that worked or not. I'd know if there's a problem. I know how to solve it, switch off the water. But beyond that, my first port of call is ring a plumber. And I think we all agree that kind of all of those trades need that type of regulation, and that you have the faith in kind of an inspection team, or in the qualified plumber in this case, that when they come they will fix it. So kind of the problem is that a lot of the homes that a lot of people live in Ireland at the moment were either built during a period when there seems to have been lax adherence to the standards which are set out, and that's what we're having in terms of Priory Hall or Longboat Quay and other ones. The other one is that there isn't a regime of inspection in place, or an audit, because we've asked the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach this week, myself, for an audit to look back and to identify the problems. Now, the state mightn't have the wherewithal to fix them, but at least that the owner or the tenant would have some idea where there's a problem, because then you can take a remedial action. There are people who will take a chance. They know that there may be a problem and they will just survive. I would urge anybody who's aware of problems around their water systems to immediately get them checked out. Because I've seen the water coming out of my radiators. It's black. If that goes into a public water system in my house, I don't know what type of stomach aches or whatever can come from it. But I don't think it would be good. There is another problem which was raised by the petitioner, was in relation to the stagnant water in the immersions, and that could be caused if you had a failure in the double valve or the back flow, that the water could remain in the system, because it's not necessarily, not everybody clears or flushes out their heating system on a regular basis, which means that you could have a contaminant within the water system for a while. So I think that's most of the questions that I have. You have identified that there potentially could be a problem here in both of your presentations in some ways, and I think at the most what we've learned is the need for the regulation to be in place as soon as possible. I know I'm putting loads of work on your hands and you're probably getting competing demands, but given that the water system, if nothing else, that is something that all the household avails of. I think it from a public health rather than even safety, but a public health that we should put any systems in place that give us the assurance that's required.
To deal with the stagnation issue?
Yeah, well, just with regard to that, then, the particular system that the petition showed, yeah, it's connected. It's connected actually from the actual house storage, whereas in fact, as I described to Minister or to Mr. Case, it shouldn't actually be connected like that. It should be connected from its own expansion tank, so that, in fact, if you do get any backflow, you're going back into a system that's only circulating within your heating system, and not back into your house water that can become potentially coming out of your taps. That shouldn't be connected like that at all. That's in the event you get backflow. With regard to the stagnation, the actual first of all, the recommendation always is that any connection is done on a very short length of pipe, so that there isn't any amount of water within it that would stagnate. And of course, when any water that would stagnate, yes, of course, could potentially give you, if heated, and I think the petitioner was raising the issue of it being in the hot press, where it might go above 20 degrees and start some growth of Legionella again, and that's always possible. But once it goes into the system, it will be heated. As I said again to Mr. Kitt, it will be heated to above 60 degrees, and the Legionella will be killed within seconds. So in most cases that isn't a risk. But I would agree with the petitioner that it shouldn't actually. It's a short way of actually feeding the actual system. It should actually be fed from its own separate tank and not from the domestic supply at all. So I suppose in general, all of the issues that have been raised have actually been poor workmanship rather than poor standards or poor requirements. It's actually been poor workmanship that's been involved in them all.
Poor workmanship because we don't have an inspection regime and we don't have standards that are enforceable. Would that be correct?
I think I wouldn't agree with you. I mean, there's an onus on a person doing a job to do it right, and and they've all been trained in most cases. We've had loads of schemes down the years, because this isn't a particularly new issue with regard to how doing that. We know how to plumb a house with an expansion vessel on it. That's been there since I was a young lad, and that's a while back. So, you know, that's not the issue. There are shortcuts being taken. They may be taken in absolute innocence, in that they don't know that this creates a different risk, or they say, oh, "What do I need that when I have the other there?" But the reality of it is that it's a workmanship issue. Yeah.
Thanks. Did anybody else want to respond to those points from Deputy O'Snoddy? No? Okay. I might just ask a few points of clarification myself then as well. One thing that intrigued me is that we were discussing the development of the Irish standards, but then, Ms Neary, in your presentation you talked about that the British standards are the ones that are being used. Could you explain to me why that is the case, that you're not stipulating the Irish standards, that you're actually, on page 3 it says that British standards have dealt with these systems for some time and the current standard is BS 8558.
No, thanks for the question actually, and the opportunity to clarify. The Irish standard is being developed at the moment, and just in the absence of it, we would, I suppose, have traditionally looked to the British standards where they apply because of our similarities in construction methods, etc. So and it was just the point that the British standards had dealt with this issue explicitly for some time, that it would be the prevailing standard here in the absence of an Irish standard. And as well as that, then the RGII, the Register for Gas Installers, would have based their guidance on that standard, the Ofteca, the Oil-Fired Plumbing Association, and the boiler manufacturers. So it was just a reference point in terms of where the guidance can be found.
Very much for clarifying that. The other issue that seems to strike me is that we could have all the standards in the world and all the rule book in the world, but they're all voluntary. So therefore, if I were to hire a plumber to build my house and to put in a substandard system that doesn't comply with the standards, and I do notice that it's substandard, what could I do? What recall have I got?
Yeah, a good point. And there's always a question, the standards are voluntary. There's two ways. First of all, if it's a fundamental point, that standard may have been referenced in the building regulations, in which case then it's a very clear black and white legal requirement, and there's no question, but the work was done incorrectly.
We're looking at, in this case, have been referenced, would you imagine, in the building regulations? Would that be normal?
This is a water supply issue, which would be governed by the Water Services Act. The building regulations deal with kind of the functional requirements in relation to buildings. So, for example, in a house we require that there is a water supply, a cold water supply and a hot water supply, and that you have a storage of cold water. So they're the kind of functional things that the building regulations would deal with, and also the prevention of the pipes freezing. But
to go back to my rogue plumber, if I was in a situation like the petitioner has mentioned, do I have any comeback?
Okay.
I would make the point that the existence of a standard is a reference point for what is best practice. It's a reference point for you as the purchaser, as a consumer. It's a reference point for the plumber. So, as I think I might have said earlier, even if it's not explicitly referenced in legislation and is therefore a voluntary standard, if you take issue and go back to the plumber, or if necessary go to a court of law, you can say this standard is here, this is best practice, and then your plumber really is on the back foot, because unless he or she can demonstrate that the method applied was for some reason better than that, or an acceptable alternative, they're in difficulty, whereas you have the reference standard to support your case.
But it's not necessarily illegal. I mean, if I drive over the speed limits, that's the reference, is the speed limit. And if I break that speed limit, there's a law to enforce the fact that I've gone over it. If a plumber is a rogue plumber and hasn't adhered to a standard, and I do take them to court, is there really any... I mean, I suppose what I'm coming to is that, is there any penalty on a rogue plumber to really incentivise them not to be? I mean, if there are shortcuts that can be taken that would save them money, and they decide, well, look, the penalties aren't that serious, then who's going to bother taking me to court, or who's even going to find out?
Okay, so I suppose the situation is that historically the local authorities were the Water Services Authority, and they had their bylaws and they were their rules, and they had authorised officers and they could inspect, and there was a whole procedure around that. We've moved now to a national Water Services Authority in Irish Water. They're around the table now in terms of writing the first ever plumbing and heating guide through the NSAI process, and on foot of that, the Department and Irish Water will be reviewing any policy or legislative requirements to implement this standard fully.
Yeah.
But to answer the question, I think what you're saying, the onus is on me as the owner of the house. Number one, to check. Number two, to find out that there's an issue, and then it's up to me to challenge the plumber who installed the system. And possibly the only route I might have is to take them to court if I feel they haven't applied the standard. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, sorry, Martin. Yeah.
Well, just in terms, like Sarah has already explained how simple and inexpensive the particular issue that we're considering here is. So I don't think you'd have a problem with your plumber if you went to them, and I don't think legal recourse would be necessary. But on a more serious issue, like with the overall quality of your house, if there's problems that building regulations and that haven't been complied with, and if you don't get engagement, the building code is enforceable, and there is legal recourse to the courts. From our experience in the last few years with the building boom, where there was widespread disregard of the regulatory requirements, we've moved to put in place a better building control framework, and that involves oversight by professionals of the construction project. Registered construction professionals have to draw up inspection plans and execute those plans with themselves and others, and certify the building when it's complete. And we're also investing in oversight by local authorities to support that system. So, the points that Deputy Osnadig and yourself made about the lack of oversight before are well made, and the system has reacted to those, and there will be better oversight by industry professionals and by local authorities of every house that's built in
So
future.
just to clarify my understanding, are those the regulations that were brought in last year, where I would have to hire an engineer as part of the building process, and they would certify all of the...
SI 9 of 2014, to be specific.
Yeah, and previous to that, there was a situation where it was really at the behest of the developer or the builder or the plumber in question to have adhered to the standards of the day.
Yes, but if that wasn't done, the standards were legally enforceable, and people themselves do have recourse by civil enforcement through the courts.
Just, sorry for being pedantic, but just explain to me the difference between a voluntary standard and something that's legally enforceable.
The building regulations aren't voluntary. Aren't voluntary. We're talking.
Okay,
I'm talking about the building regulations.
Okay.
They're not voluntary. They have to be complied with. They're mandatory.
Fair enough.
Yes. If I may come in on that, I think you're talking about if you don't comply with the building regulations, it's a crime. But if your workmanship is defective, and then it becomes an issue in the ultimate case for the courts to decide. And I'm not a lawyer, but in my experience, the courts will reference the standards that pertain in Ireland and in Europe, and that will make it a very clear decision point. So I think the issue in the hypothetical, or for many people a very real situation you describe, it's not to determine whether the workmanship was adequate or not. That's fairly easily determined because the reference points are there. The problem is, as you know, is the developer, is the plumber available to seek redress from in the civil action.
To bring it back then to the petition, and just want to clarify this, because we will be coming back to this at a later date. The petition alludes to the potential that there may be over 100,000 households affected by this particular issue with this particular type of non-return valve. Is that possible, in your opinion, that so many houses in Ireland might potentially be affected by this type of issue of a faulty non-returning valve, or water being contaminated by the lack of that temporary connection being disconnected Mr. Smith, you alluded to you needed 3 elements basically for the water to be contaminated. So is it potential that that has happened in the case of over 100,000 systems?
Sorry, if I could just say that that's a hypothetical question. The point is we don't actually have evidence. We've had no other complaints about this issue. So we just don't have any evidence with which we can give you an objective answer to the question.
Okay.
We're more than open to sharing that evidence and hearing from it if anybody else has that. But it is a hypothetical question. I think it's clear from what my colleagues have said here that there's a technical, they've confirmed in technical terms that this backflow issue does occur. But in terms of the scale and the significance of that on the water quality, it's not really a matter for ourselves. We don't deal with the quality of the water, and perhaps if you brought in Irish Water, they can deal with that aspect of the matter, or the HSE if it's a public health matter.
Sorry, Deputy.
Just on that.
Sorry.
I would say, when you say it could occur, we have no evidence that it actually has occurred at all. And you made the point. You're right. I made the point earlier on. If it's done right, you need 3 things to happen in order for it to actually have contamination at all. So it's just a point.
On the flip side of that, you don't have any evidence that it hasn't. So
well,
there's no evidence.
we seem to be hearing a lot, though,
well, I'm just
very quickly.
I'm trying to play devil's advocate on behalf of the petitioner.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
We'll give you that one.
Yeah.
but
so
we
there's
can't.
no evidence either way. There's no way we could know.
But we can only act. Like we're dealing with a regulatory process here. We depend on objective, evidence-based analysis for the decisions we make. We have to justify any regulatory steps we take. So.
But what I am hearing you saying is that you've had no cases brought to your attention. Not a single case has been brought to your attention.
Except this case.
Other than through the petitioner.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
It's on the same issue because the petitioner went further than the 100,000. He suggested that with that dead leg part that we talked about earlier in the hot tank, that it could potentially be kind of over 300,000 houses. Now, I don't know. As I said, I'm not an expert, but I would have presumed if somebody flagged up an issue or a potential issue, and it's the same argument with others, is that somebody needs to do an audit, whether it's you go and check a number of the estates that the petitioner has spoken about in his letters to us to see if it is an issue, and then you would have some idea, because he made the point in his petition that there was a number of estates in an area in Meath that kind of had these problems identified by himself. I presume that's where he works or worked, and that he came across kind of shoddy workmanship. And that's often the way kind of that you identify kind of the likes of fire hazard, or in this case kind of a potential health hazard. If that's the case, then it begs that somebody needs to go and do an audit of those houses and also flag up to other plumbers kind of when you're doing work on heating systems throughout the country, if you identify this problem, please refer to us. Fix it, but refer to us so that we can kind of have an audit of the rest of the estate. If you walk into a new estate, or at this stage they're old estates, kind of in County Kildare, and you're a plumber and you identify kind of nobody's been near the heating system since it was built, but look, there's a problem. Immediately that person should be kind of informing somebody that there may be a problem in the estate as a whole, and especially if potentially it has a public health nature to it. So, as I said in relation to other things, some of it is an audit, some of it's inspections, and since the inspections we're talking about are for future builds, somebody somewhere has to look at the existing houses. Otherwise, you end up with what we have in Dublin, the stuff I mentioned about lead pipes. The house that I moved out of had lead pipes, kind of which is swollen to 3 times the size. that was the nature of all of the Dublin City Council houses in the city. I don't know whether it was a major health hazard, but as far as I know, lead in water is a health hazard. Maybe that's why I'm a bit mad drinking that water. But it is something that Irish Water has identified in its documentation to date. It hasn't come up with a solution other than the householder will fix that part.
Well, there is a strategy for lead piping in plumbing systems, and that is being implemented at the moment. So there is a process in place for that.
Diverge too much into
hopefully the new owner.
Just one final one I just wanted to raise with you. My understanding was that you've referenced the RGI and the gas boiler installation. If I'm not incorrect, there was a case where over 100,000 gas boilers were found to have been installed illegally. That was in a regulated sector. It was said on the record of the Dáil quite a while back. But, that was in a sector which you've referenced as being quite regulated and where the standards have been reached. You've talked about the plumbing arena not being at that level whatsoever yet, and I think we're not quite at that high standard of plumbing, I think was mentioned earlier on. So then I just want to again question, if we found that in an area that was so-called regulated, is there the potential that we might have we could, as the petitioner has instance, that we may have a problem in the plumbing area as well? Is there any way we'd know if there
I don't know. Again, like you're comparing maybe apples and oranges. I mean, that problem with the boilers in the regulated area, there is a regulator in place, the Commission for Energy Regulator, who can deal with problems in that area. And whatever the appropriate response is, you look to the Commission for Energy Regulation for that. But
I suppose what I'm pointing to is the use of the regulation. At least the regulation in that scenario has pointed up to a very big problem in that area. We could potentially have a similar problem in the plumbing area, but because of the lack of regulation, we won't know.
And you do absolutely.
Is that the point? Yes.
Yeah. So, again, that's a kind of a hypothetical thesis.
Yeah.
But I mean, we can only respond to evidence-based analysis, and we can only progress regulation on that basis.
That type of evidence isn't being collected, and we have no mechanism to collect that type of data at present.
I wouldn't. It definitely hasn't been collected or presented to us. Yeah.
All right.
I suppose just to clarify that we are from the Architectural and Building Standards Unit, and that we wouldn't have that information in terms of gas boilers or water supply, plumbing statistics like that. So, there may be other people that you need to talk to in terms of that kind of information.
No, I'm just trying to surmise that even from the water point of view, which we're looking at here, that we don't seem to have that regulatory regime where that type of thing would be picked up on. It's really very much dependent on...
Water supply is regulated and has been regulated.
Yes.
I suppose it wouldn't... there is a Water Services Act. It apportions the responsibility to people in terms of ensuring that water supply isn't contaminated, it isn't misused, it isn't unduly leaked, etc. And we do have a national authority for it. So, I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of structures in place.
I suppose the point being, just to bring it back, at my house, unless I've never had anybody from the local authority or Irish Water come to check my radiator system, my water system internally. So really, it will be up to me to bring somebody in to look at my system to check if this type of non-return valve issue is in my house.
Well, I suppose where the inspectorate kind of comes in is that you may get your water tested at some point in time, and domestic situations do get tested.
Yes. That would be through the local, that's testing the actual sample of the water.
The sample of the water.
To check if the system has been installed properly.
Well, I suppose the risk is the contamination and the water supply. That's the...
But the onus, again, is on the owner of the house to check whether the... Yeah, I just wanted to be very, very clear. I think think we're finished, actually. So I just, was there anything else you wanted to add, or any of our witnesses wanted to conclude on, or are we happy enough with what we covered? Questions? Okay, well, at this stage I would like to, on behalf of the Joint Committee on Public Service Oversight and Petitions, I'd like to thank you all for attending today and for engaging with the committee on this issue. And I propose that the Joint Committee stands adjourned till 4 p.m. on Wednesday the 14th of October in Committee Room 3. Thank you.